Bruno from Arvine TV. Today we're going to try a little recipe for making soft glazed donuts, but we're actually going to modify that recipe a little bit and not only make soft glazed donuts, we're actually going to do some jelly filled donuts using the same dough, just changing the process towards the end a little bit. Now, I'll be right up front for our viewers. This is actually the first time I'm attempting this recipe, so you're going to be able to see everything right from start to finish. So first things that we'll start off with is we have a listing of ingredients which I'll post below the video for you to use. We're going to need a half a cup of butter, and you're going to want to leave that and get it to room temperature. If you're just looking at this and going through the video, if you need it at room temperature, you can also put it in a measuring cup, heat it up in the microwave a little bit to get it up to temperature. That's a little cheat that can be used. You're going to need a cup and a half of milk. I'm actually using 1%. It does recommend that you use 2% or whole milk, but I find there's not a huge variation in most of the recipes when I use the 1%. So that's personal preference for you. We are going to need 6 tablespoons of sugar. We're going to need 4.5 tablespoons of dry yeast, which I've already prepped out. You want to make sure your yeast is good, that it hasn't been sitting around forever, and then 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Now you're going to need a little over 5 1/4 cups of flour. I've divided our flour into 2 cups, which we're going to use right away when we mix the primary ingredients, and the remaining flour in a second bowl, just so that I'm not having to count out as we're mixing it. You're also going to need 3 large eggs, and again, these should be at room temperature. Do not put these ones in the microwave or you're going to get a surprise. And then you'll need a dough hook for a later step, and then just good mixer attachment, a flat mixer attachment itself. So what you're going to want to do to get started is we're going to want to take our first ingredients. We're going to want to take our milk, our salt, our yeast, our sugar, as well as our butter. And yes, it is warm, so it wants to stick a little bit. So we're going to take that out. And then what I like to do is I like to get that, they recommend adding the eggs and the flour at the same time, but what I'm going to do is I like to get the yeast anytime I'm working with yeast starting to mix. So I just put that on stir. We're going to get that stirring, and at the same time we can start to add in our eggs. And that'll just give a little chance for the yeast to start activating and getting everything mixed up. And if it starts activating properly, you should start to smell a little change in the mixture. And then what we're going to want to do next is actually add in our flour slowly. And we're going to want that to mix together for approximately 2 to 3 minutes. So I'm just taking a note on the timer right behind us. And what it will start to do is it's going to start to look a consistency more like a cake dough type idea. When you get to that consistency, you're just about there. Then what you'll want to do is scrape down the sides of the bowl. It'll start to become a little more doughy, and then we're going to switch over to our dough hook. So we're going to let this run for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come right back and pick up from that. Okay, so our mixer's been running at about a medium speed for the last 2 to 3 minutes. Our dough is starting to look like a cake batter essentially, and that's where you'll know you're ready. I'll bring that up so you can get a little closer look. At this point, what we're going to want to do is actually switch over to a dough hook. So we'll just scrape a little bit of this off. That way nothing goes to waste. Now, this is a nice recipe that you can use at home, or again, as our channel suggests, if you're out RVing, you can actually, instead of carrying a big mixer, use a smaller mixer. So we're going to switch to our dough hook and actually do this if you're entertaining and you're away in your RV. So we're going to want to bring that up. We're going to want to put this to stir, and then we're going to want to add the remainder of our flour in. And this way we're actually working on the final dough. I like to take a little bit of time, add that in, really allow it to mix together nicely so that we're not putting too much flour in. And you'll just want to keep an eye on it, make sure that that dough hook is really mixing it around, that you're getting a good consistency across the board. And then, as I mentioned, normally you're going to make regular donuts. You can cut them with a donut cutter, or if you have some cookie cutters, and then with a smaller cutter, cut the center out. We're actually going to modify this recipe to make some jelly-filled donuts. You could also do it and fill it with some whipped cream or some custard if you like. And then the final part that we're actually going to modify is we're going to take some of that dough, we're going to roll it into our donut sizes. Then we're going to wrap them up individually and freeze them. And we're going to try a little experiment which we'll bring to you in another time. We're going to take those frozen donuts out eventually and likely in a few days and just cook it. So that way you can make a larger recipe, because this recipe says it's going to make about 25 traditional sized donuts. Well, I don't know about you, but 25 donuts is a lot for me to eat. Don't get me wrong, I could do it. Just prefer not to do it at 1 or 2 sittings. So if you're not hosting a whole bunch of people and all you're really going to do is want to make some donuts for a small group, yourself and your partner, 25 donuts is a lot. And what I find with recipes is if you start partitioning them down, they don't always work out by saying, okay, I want to make 8 donuts. So instead of, using the full recipe, we'll do a third of it and cut everything down in thirds. Doesn't always work out that way. So this will be a little experiment to be able to freeze it. So even if all of a sudden you have some last minute guests coming over, and also again, if you're traveling in your RV, make them at home, freeze them, take them with you, and then fry them up as you need them. I want to see if the consistency and the freshness is going to stay. So we'll bring that to you in a later video. So we're going to keep adding a little bit to the ball here. What we do want to do is drop this down, pull the dough down on the dough hook a little bit before we add the last little bit of flour, put it back to stir, and we're going to add in that last little bit. We're getting very close to this being ready, but we're going to let that run for a few minutes. So our mixer has been running for about 2 to 3 minutes, mixing the dough really well. You're going to want to remove it. Take our dough hook, pull that dough hook out, get as much dough off as you can. Now what we're going to want to do, you're going to see here how our consistency has changed. We just want to make sure we scrape down the sides, have a really nice ball of dough here. So we're just going to scrape the sides down, make sure it's nice and clean. And what we're going to want to do is put our dough to rise. This should take anywhere from an hour, hour and a half to about 2 hours. So plan that you're going to need at least a good hour and a half to 2 hours. It may take a little longer depending on the conditions. You want to put this in a dry place that's warm. Best bet is actually cover it up with a nice clean kitchen towel. Now a little tip that I like to do is I actually like to take my oven, set it on the keep warm function, and start to preheat it. Now I don't actually preheat it to the keep warm. I actually let it preheat for about a minute or so, just to get a little bit of heat, and even a minute might be a little long. You'll have to judge each oven individually. But basically what you're doing is just putting a bit of heat in the oven. Don't let it get above 90 or 100. You really want it to just be barely warm. Then we're going to put our dough in the oven and let it sit for that 1 to 2 hours, or until it's about doubled in size. That little bit of extra heat will help it rise, really get it to the degree that it should be. So we're going to actually do that now. So for example, that's only been running while I've been talking to you. At this point in time, I'm canceling that, so the heating's going to go off. We'll put it in there, and you'll notice there's just barely any heat. We're going to leave that in there. We'll come back in about the next hour and a half, 2 hours, show you the results, and go on to the next steps. Go.